quick caveat here. This video does require a good knowledge of both the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio series and the first two Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books. If you are unfamiliar with these, you might not enjoy it. For that matter, you might not enjoy it even if you are familiar with these. But what can I do? For reasons best known to myself, I wanted to do a deep dive into the history of the writing of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. The basic story of this is fairly well known. It started out as a radio series, it became a book, then there was another radio series and another book which may have been written at the same time, then there was a TV series, and then various other things like plays, an illustrated guide, and latterly a movie. But really I just want to talk about the creation of the first book, although we might talk about the creation of the second book as well. As well as being books, films, radio series, TV series and films, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy exists in a large number of different versions. I tend to find that people don't really try to explain the differences, but I'm the kind of person who should get out more, and I wanted to investigate why Hitchhikers exists in so many versions. If you want to the too long didn't watch version of this, it's basically that Douglas Adams wanted to write for Doctor Who, and that caused all the problems. One of the problems about talking about Douglas Adams is that many of the stories told about him are true, but not necessarily the truth. One of the earliest stories told about Douglas Adams is, of course, the creation of the phrase Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We are told that Douglas Adams was lying in a field outside Innsbruck in 1971, shortly before going to university, and he was out of money, had very little in his rucksack apart from dirty clothes and a purloined copy of the Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe, and he looked up at the stars and thought, wouldn't it be fun to have a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Now the problem with this story is, while probably true, it's not actually how Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came about. He just came up with an interesting phrase. In fact, Douglas Adams didn't just try to walk back this story in later life. He also began to believe that he had repeated it so often that he wasn't entirely sure that it had actually happened. In fact, some people on holiday with him in Greece in 1974 say that they first heard the phrase Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy then. The thing is that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was just a phrase in 1971. It wasn't for another 6 years before he actually attached it to anything, and that's where it became important. At St John's College, Cambridge, between 1971 and 1974, Douglas Adams, as well as studying English literature, was trying to get into the Footlights. The Cambridge Footlights is a sort of dramatic society which puts on comedy reviews throughout the year and tries to have a year-end show that usually goes to Edinburgh and sometimes even into the West End. Although Douglas Adams got into the Footlights in about 1972, he didn't really fit in well with it. They didn't really like his sketches. He found himself teaming up with another couple of people and making his own sort of mini review shows under the guise of Adams Smith Adams. Douglas Adams, as part of Adams Smith Adams, did manage to get material into the Cambridge Footlights review in 1974, which was called, the review was called Chox, that is C-H-O-X, although Douglas Adams was not chosen to perform. However, when Chox had a brief residency in the West End in 1974, he did of course go to the first night party, where he met a certain Graham Chapman of Monty Python fame. In 1974, Graham Chapman's writing partner, John Cleese, had decided to step away from Monty Python for a brief time and pursue other projects. Graham Chapman was therefore looking for another writing partner and saw something in Douglas Adams. The fact that Douglas Adams is about the same height as both Graham Chapman and John Cleese probably has nothing to do with it. It's just one of those strange coincidences. Douglas Adams and Graham Chapman spent a year or so writing together on various projects. Douglas Adams and Neil Innes are the only two people to have got material into Monty Python other than the original 6 creators. Douglas Adams also makes a couple of brief appearances in the 4th season of Monty Python's Flying Circus. They are kind of blink and you miss them, but you'll know them if you know them. Among a number of unsuccessful collaborations, Douglas Adams and Graham Chapman produced a TV comedy pilot for a proposed series which was going to be called Out of the Trees. It never got it beyond its pilot though. As well as this collaboration with Graham Chapman, between 1974 and about 1977, Douglas Adams was trying to get things on BBC Radio. BBC Radio was at the time possibly one of the easiest ways into comedy. They had shows like Weekending, which was a weekly satirical show where you could basically walk in off the streets and submit material. Weekending was still running in the 1990s, and I actually walked in off the streets one or two times myself. While he did get the odd bit of material on BBC Radio, he did have to get a number of other jobs, famously for a Middle Eastern royal family, and quite a lot of time was spent cleaning out chicken sheds. He had caught the notice of a senior radio producer called Simon Brett. Simon Brett could see that Douglas Adams was a talent, but a talent without a niche. He decided to call Douglas Adams in for a meeting in February 1977. At this meeting they talked over many things and came up with the idea that Douglas Adams should attempt to write a science fiction comedy show. In later years, neither of them could quite remember who came up with the idea. Each one said the other one did. But Douglas Adams went away and started to write it. His first ideas were to do a show called The Ends of the Earth, where the Earth would be destroyed in various blackly comic science fiction scenarios. One of these scenarios would be to have a man fighting a faceless bureaucracy who wanted to knock his house down, only for a galactic faceless bureaucracy to turn up and destroy the entire Earth. That particular scenario stuck in his mind, and he thought, well, how about if this man has a best friend, and his best friend is a researcher for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? And this is where we get the beginnings of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So his pilot episode was essentially a man getting his house knocked down by a cruel bureaucracy, only to have the Earth destroyed by a cruel galactic bureaucracy. But this time the hero, who was at the time called Alaric B, although this did become very quickly Arthur Dent, was rescued by his best friend, who happened to be from a planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and was of course a researcher for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He delivered his pilot episode to the BBC in March, together with an overview of future episodes, which read like sort of Planet of the Week or Species of the Week kind of stories, where they would actually be doing some proper researching for the guide. In early April, his pilot episode for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was accepted and scheduled for recording sometime in June. Douglas Adams then made a somewhat fateful decision. For a number of years, one of his ambitions had been to write for Doctor Who. Doctor Who was going through a particular strong patch at the time. The Doctor, Tom Baker, had really taken control of everybody's idea of what the perfect Doctor should be, and you could make the argument he did the same for several decades afterwards. While Tom Baker is very capable of being extremely serious at times, he did have that clownish, slightly comedic sensibility. So Doctor Who in 1977 was slightly funnier and more comedic than it was in other times. Douglas Adams has a finished pilot script. It is going to be made into a pilot radio episode. So he sends this pilot script off to the Doctor Who people, hoping that they'll like it. I believe he actually sent the script off to Robert Holmes, who at the time was script editor of Doctor Who. A script editor at the time was kind of like a showrunner. They wouldn't necessarily write all the scripts, but they might have to heavily edit the scripts that they had sent in by other people. The script editor also had a large role in setting the direction of Doctor Who throughout the seasons that they wrote in. In June 1977, the pilot is recorded. They bring in Simon Jones to play Arthur Dent and Geoffrey McGivern to play Ford Prefect. Now, the important role of the voice of the book, which in many ways I think makes the series unique and interesting, they decide they need a voice, a bit of something like a Peter Jones voice. Peter Jones was a comic actor and did quite a lot of work on the radio, especially in long-running panel games. His voice is unique and authoritative but calming, so very suitable for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Having decided that they wanted a Peter Jonesy voice, they approached Michael Palin to see if he wanted to do it. Eventually they decided maybe they should go for Peter Jones instead. As somebody who is a massive fan of the radio series, I feel that Peter Jones's narration as the book is the thing that really puts this radio series above any other offering. I have to stress here, it's a radio series, not a radio play. You can call it a radio comedy if you want. Please just don't call it a radio play. You'll upset me. Shortly before they record this pilot, the Doctor Who people get back in touch with Douglas Adams. They love his pilot script, and they're doing a season-long arc called Key to Time. 6 different stories of 6 different fragments of a key to time spread throughout the universe. Maybe he has some ideas about that, and maybe he could send them to them. Douglas Adams duly sends in ideas for his Doctor Who story, and on the 18th of July 1977 he is commissioned to write a story for the Key to Time season-long arc of Doctor Who. Now it takes a while for the great and good at BBC Radio to listen to the pilot episode of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and decide whether or not they want to go for a full series. This seemed to be because a lot of people at the BBC go off on holidays at times during July and August, and there's never a quorum of people to make the decision. But at the end of August 1977, a decision is made. 5 more episodes, please. We'll have a full season or series of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, at this point, Simon Brett, the man who encouraged Douglas Adams to write The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the man who produced the pilot episode, has left the BBC. He's gone to be head of comedy at LWT, which is a franchise of ITV, which is the only non-BBC television channel in Britain at the time. His place as producer is taken by Geoffrey Perkins. Now, if you're deeply pretentious, and I rarely miss an opportunity to be deeply pretentious, you might say that Geoffrey Perkins is to Douglas Adams as George Martin is to the Beatles. That is definitely overdoing it a bit, but Geoffrey Perkins was certainly somebody who understood what Douglas Adams was trying to do with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and did his best to make it happen. So for the rest of the 1977, Douglas Adams is somewhat busy writing and recording the next 3 episodes of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. They bring in Mark Wing-Davey as Zaphod Beeblebrox, Susan Sheridan as Trillian, and Stephen Moore as Marvin the Paranoid Android. He also has to finish his Doctor Who scripts. In January 1977, he hands in his final scripts for his Doctor Who story, The Pirate Planet. Now, it should be pointed out that at this time, a Doctor Who was released as 25-minute episodes every week, probably about 24 in a year, 6 4-episode stories. Although each episode is 25 minutes long, with titles and repeat sequences, they would come out at an average of about 22.5 minutes, meaning the full story would be about 90 minutes long. So Douglas Adams had basically handed in the script for a very low-budget feature film. And as a result of all this work, Douglas Adams found himself in January 1978 with massive writer's block. There's just nothing left in the tank. He did, however, have a mate, a best mate, a guy he'd met at Cambridge, and a guy he had lived together on and off for many years. His name is John Lloyd, and he was able to get in touch with John Lloyd and ask for help, which John Lloyd was more than happy to give. Best friends, after all. And he turned up at Douglas Adams' place with a plastic bag containing a draft of his unfinished comedy science fiction novel called Gygax. Yeah, incidentally, John Lloyd is very aware of the coincidence that his unfinished comedy novel was called Gygax, and that there is a person called Gary Gygax who invented D&D. Essentially what John Lloyd says is, look, hey, I've got this unfinished novel, let's see if we can put something together. In some ways, John Lloyd downplays the collaboration he has with Douglas Adams. He talks in terms of it more him being somebody he makes it easier for Douglas Adams to write. As a writer, Douglas Adams was something of a perfectionist, often achieving negative daily word counts, and was known for his procrastination when he got blocked in his writing. One of his solutions for writer's block was luxuriating in a bath followed by some Bovril sandwiches. Apparently Douglas Adams once said that the character Zaphod Beeblebrox was the result of 3 baths and 3 sets of Bovril sandwiches. So what John Lloyd often says he did was make things easier for Douglas Adams to write. And as I said, he downplays his creative input, but also almost certainly there was he put quite a lot of creative input into working with Douglas Adams. This may become important later. For the most part, what John Lloyd claims to have done is to make it easy for Douglas Adams to write, easy for Douglas Adams to be creative. The word facilitator comes to mind, but it's probably too much management speak. Douglas Adams and John Lloyd collaborate for about 3 weeks. They got on very well, they write very well together, and they get the last 2 scripts, episodes 5 and 6, done. These are recorded in February, ready for broadcast in March and April. The way that the BBC would organise broadcasting comedy programmes at the time is that they'd have a half-hour slot at 6:30 in the evenings, and then another slot, and then the comedy programme would be repeated at 11 o'clock on a different night. The other thing to point out about BBC radio comedy at the time is that back in the 1950s, there were BBC radio comedies like The Goon Show and Hancock's Half Hour, which would essentially stop traffic. Television would not bother to put on anything interesting while The Goon Show or Hancock's Half Hour were on. There was no point, because everybody would be listening to those shows. Radio comedy became less important in the 1960s, but you still had shows like Round the Horn and Beyond Our Ken, which still were able to sort of push the dial and change electricity usage to a certain extent. But in 1978, this sort of thing had not happened for at least a decade. But I wouldn't be mentioning all that if something like it didn't happen to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy very quickly caught the zeitgeist, whether it is the guide itself, or the infinite improbability drive, or the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. But not towels. Towels come later. We'll get to towels. It left the somewhat dusty realm of radio review columns in newspapers. This was still a time when they had radio review columns and indeed newspapers. It entered into the main pages of newspapers and became a major talking point. There was great excitement by the time they got to the final episode. And that fade out at the end of the 6th episode to Louis Armstrong playing What a Wonderful World was quite beautiful and was very well received. Now, of course, this didn't entirely happen in a vacuum. A year before, in 1977, a certain movie called Star Wars had made quite a splash and had been very well received in Britain. And people saw lots of opportunities for merchandising and tie-ins in that. And they saw similar things with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The only people who didn't really see this were the BBC. There's a great long story I could tell you about the BBC and commercialism and why it doesn't do it. It's basically that they want to protect the licence fee, and anytime they make any commercial advances, there are great calls to cancel the licence fee entirely. And the BBC are very, very dependent on the licence fee. And this was even more true in 1978. The BBC really didn't think commercially at the time, and it was left to other people to do things. In fact, in the late 1950s, they had a hit television show called Quatermass and the Pit, and Penguin Books published the scripts of that. The publisher's target had been publishing novelisations of Doctor Who since 1974. So it occurred to quite a lot of publishers that a novelisation of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy might do rather well. Douglas Adams and John Lloyd were approached by a number of publishing companies, but it was Nick Webb at Pan Books who eventually signed up Douglas Adams and John Lloyd to write the novelisation or an adaptation of the radio series. At this point, all things seem set fair. Douglas Adams and John Lloyd planned to go to Corfu in September and spend a month writing the book. In the meantime, Douglas Adams has got a job as a radio producer at BBC Radio Comedy, and in fact has an office right next to John Lloyd. But it's hardly going to be a story if there's a happy ending. It's rather complicated what happens next. Basically, John Lloyd gets himself a new agent, and this agent is rather too keen on the possibilities for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He starts making noises about percentages of the Hitchhiker's royalties and merchandising rights in perpetuity. This is not quite the thing that John Lloyd wants. He wants to write a novel with his best mate. He doesn't want all the other gubbins. But agents be agenting. This is what agents are supposed to do. But it does appear that this agent is rather aggressive. And one of the people who gets spooked by the aggression of this agent is Douglas Adams. Douglas Adams has kind of come to the conclusion that he needs to write Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by himself. As much as he values the help that John Lloyd gave to him, and as much as he values their friendship, he wants to write the book by himself. So he decides to write John Lloyd a letter. A Dear John letter. It is cold, it is impersonal, and frankly rather rude. John Lloyd is essentially being sacked. Even today, John Lloyd still feels conflicted about this. He understood the rationale behind Douglas Adams' decision. Of course, Douglas Adams was a creative force behind it. He was just the guy who helped out. But at the same time, he enjoyed the process. He enjoys the friendship. And getting a cold, impersonal letter from his best friend, who works 10 feet away from him in the office next door, who could have stuck his head round the door and say, "John, I need a word, can we go out for a drink?" but chose instead something cold and impersonal. It didn't feel good. It really felt extremely bad, and he was extremely angry for a time. He didn't actually see Douglas Adams for a couple of days after receiving the letter, but then on the street outside the BBC, Douglas Adams saw him and went, "Hi John, how are you?" Waved at him, and John Lloyd was rather angry and told Douglas Adams in no uncertain terms while he was angry. When he brings up the letter, of course, Douglas Adams brings up the aggressive agent, and there is a bit of a row and a standoff for a time. But they're best friends, and they make it up. They're still going to go on that holiday in Corfu in September. Douglas Adams is going to be writing the novel by himself, and when he comes to adapt episodes 5 and 6, he will endeavour to take out most, if not all, of the John Lloyd stuff. John Lloyd gets to keep half of the advance they were paid by Pan, in recognition of, his work and his help for Douglas Adams. Shortly before his trip to Corfu with John Lloyd to write the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy novel, Douglas Adams is approached by BBC Radio Comedy, who ask him if he'd like to write a Christmas episode of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, the end of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, the end of episode 6, 2 characters are stranded on Earth 2 million years in the past, completely outside the space lanes with no hope of rescue. The other 3 main characters, Marvin the Paranoid Android, Zaphod Beeblebrox and Trillian, have all been eaten by a carbon copy of the ravenous bug bladder beast of Trial. So of course, Douglas Adams says he'd love to write a Christmas episode. John Lloyd has described the writing of the first draft in Corfu as a rather strange event. John Lloyd was down on the beach enjoying himself. Douglas Adams was sat in the villa they'd rented, typing away at a typewriter that he had mysteriously purloined from the BBC. During this period, Douglas Adams seems to have written a first draft. Now, I can't say for certain exactly what was the content of this draft. The only story you get about it is that it read like a Kurt Vonnegut novel, and Douglas Adams didn't want to write a Kurt Vonnegut novel. It is likely that in this first draft, towels come into effect. Apparently, Douglas Adams had not had a lot of fun on previous holidays to Greece because he could never seem to find where his towel is, while his other friends, possibly John Lloyd included, were having a lot of fun on the beach, which might well have involved Swedish stewardesses. So back in Britain, Douglas Adams has got a number of things to do. His 6-month contract as a BBC radio producer is up, and he's got another job. He's been offered the job of script editor for Doctor Who. This is a 15-month appointment and may well be the last salaried job that Douglas Adams ever held. Now, this is quite an interesting appointment, given the commentary for Douglas Adams's story, The Pirate Planet, on DVD. In that commentary, the script editor at the time said that Douglas Adams's script had plenty of good ideas and had plenty of stuff great about it, but it was a bit of a mess and needed quite a lot of work to fix it up. So there is part of me that thinks, well, maybe they're giving it to Douglas Adams as sort of, hey, Mr. Adams, we suffered for your art. Now it's your turn. And this is perhaps no joke. One of the major stories that Douglas Adams wrote on for this particular season of Doctor Who was Destiny of the Daleks. This would be the first time that Tom Baker's Doctor had faced the Daleks for almost 5 years, and was indeed the last Doctor Who script written by the Daleks' creator, Terry Nation. There are rumours that it was in a very fragmentary state, and Douglas Adams had to do quite a lot of rewriting. Douglas Adams also wrote 2 more stories during his stint as script editor for Doctor Who. One was a story called City of Death, which he co-wrote with the producer Graham Williams, and it was based on a story by David Fisher. Looking back at City of Death now, you may recognise some of the elements that Douglas Adams later reused in his Dirk Gently stories. By a stroke of fate and ITV being off the air due to strikes, City of Death was the most watched Doctor Who story for many, many years. In fact, I think it was only beaten by one of the later David Tennant Christmas episodes. I read in one rather complimentary account of the show in an episode guide, just when you think it couldn't get any better, John Cleese appears. The other Doctor Who story that Douglas Adams wrote was a story called Shada. Although this was fully written by Douglas Adams, it wasn't actually finished. because it was the BBC's turn to go on strike when it was being made. In asking Douglas Adams to write a Christmas episode of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the BBC were holding out the possibility that there would be a second series or second season of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a further 5 episodes after the Christmas episode. And certainly that is what happened. In early 1979, another 5 episodes were commissioned by the BBC. The 8th episode was recorded in May 1979. So it means that in 1979, Douglas Adams was absurdly busy, script editing Doctor Who, writing the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy novel, and writing the second season of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio show. But unfortunately, I couldn't really find any decent sources for what exactly happened in Douglas Adams' writing of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy novel. There is only one story, and this again is one of those Douglas Adams stories which is probably true but not actually the truth. The story goes that after missing 10 deadlines, Douglas Adams was contacted by the publisher who said, "We are sending a bike, finish the page you're on." Now, did this happen? Almost certainly. But does this really tell the truth? Almost certainly not. The story has a number of problems. Quite apart from anything else, what are 10 deadlines? What does that mean? We're not told what the average length between these deadlines is. If it's, if it's only a day, then he's late by 2 weeks. If it's a week, then he's late by 2.5 months. So we're not really given any useful information. The only other quote we know about Douglas Adams and deadlines is that he loved them. He loved the sound they made as they whooshed past. And also the term, finish the page you're on, kind of implies that the moment the motorbike arrives back at the publisher, they rush it through typesetting and then get the presses rolling almost immediately. And that is not how publishing works, not even a little bit. If we skip forward to October 1979, October the 12th to be exact, this is the publication day of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The print run is 80,000 copies. A normal print run for a science fiction novel would be about 10,000 copies. So they're obviously expecting very good things of this novel. They're expecting this novel to sell very well, and they are fully justified in it. In the first 3 months after publication, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sells 250,000 copies in the UK. This is an 8th printing of the first edition of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's printed in 1980, which implies that maybe they'd sold over 500,000 copies by this time. The sheer size of the print run and the fact they bring out an accompanying LP of which is a re-recording of the first 4 episodes of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy seem to speak that there was a lot of confidence in this particular product. The size of the print run and the widespread distribution of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy probably meant the whole thing had been ordered several months before, say at the beginning of August. That means they were confident in whatever they had at the beginning of August. In fact, we can kind of make out that the latest date that Douglas Adams could have delivered his final script would be possibly a month before that, because you've got to do editing, typesetting and proofreading. That means it's probably sometime in early to mid-July when sort of everything was finalised. Now, there's kind of a problem with it, because we don't know what state the novel was in at the time, and certainly not at the time of finish the page you're on. We need to look into what the final novel looks like, and what is missing and what is added. Because what is missing is episodes 5 and 6. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is an adaptation of just episodes 1 to 4. Douglas Adams was contracted for episodes 1 to 6. So something's gone on there. There are 2 episodes missing. Also, the end of the novel strongly implies that there will be a sequel. So presumably somebody's decided to allow for a sequel. Now, that's no problem if the book sells well. They're expecting it to sell well. So a sequel is not a problem, but it's still a major decision. A major decision to deal with the fact that 5 and 6 aren't there. Also, a straightforward adaptation of episodes 1 to 4 wouldn't really give you something that you could call a novel. Everyone would appear to die at the end, and nobody really has anything to do before that, other than run away from the Galactic Police. It's all of a bit of a downer. If you want a sequel, you've got to prepare for it, give it some kind of forward momentum. Now, this is of course done in the final novel, and it is interesting to me that Douglas Adams solves it in the same way that he solves the problem of how to actually write episode 7. In episode 7, Douglas Adams makes Zaphod Beeblebrox, who up till now has been an agent of chaos and a thief, and makes him into a POV character, point of view character. He also gives Zaphod a mission, and this provides forward impetus for the rest of the story. We spend most of episode 7 and indeed episode 8 basically following what Zaphod is doing. Similarly, in the novel, we get a POV chapter of Zaphod Beeblebrox, who was president of the galaxy, steals the starship Heart of Gold when he's supposed to be launching it. And we also get different point of view chapters for Zaphod Beeblebrox, where he describes the mission that he has discovered that he is actually on. Now, I would argue this gives a forward momentum to the novel, and although it ends abruptly, there is still plenty of things that need to be sorted out in the world of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and they will be sorted out, presumably, in the sequel. The feeling still persists. The major changes that are needed to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and putting up with the missing episodes 5 and 6 and making episodes 1 to 4 into a novel, these are major problems. They take major discussions. So while I think the story of Finish the Page You're On is true, I think the problems of the episodes 5 and 6 and how to fix episodes 1 to 4 to become a novel are things that were dealt with much earlier. Possibly still when we were in 1978, even early 1979. I suspect what he might have been trying to do was have something that suggested, the forward momentum as they leave, and possibly he was writing a Hitchhiker's Guide story to act as a coda for the book. That's the sort of thing he did in Life, the Universe and Everything. But something I found out when I was researching this did give me a rather intriguing thought. One of the books I looked into was Nick Webb's book, Wish You Were Here, which is the official biography of Douglas Adams. I have a lot of problems with this book. Although Nick Webb was the person who signed Douglas Adams to Pan initially, he doesn't get an awful lot of things right. He makes the spat between John Lloyd and Douglas Adams much more serious than it actually was, completely ignores the fact that they did actually go on that holiday to Corfu, and doesn't quite get how the ending of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy went. What he says is that it actually ended with the Vogons attacking. This is, of course, the beginning of Restaurant at the End of the Universe. The Vogons attack, Arthur Dent ties up the ship's computer by asking for a cup of tea, the Heart of Gold is defenceless, and Zaphod Beeblebrox decides to hold a seance. As a result of the seance, Arthur, Ford and Trillian are left on board a dead ship with some excellent tea, and Marvin and Zaphod are just whiffs of smoke. Obviously Nick Webb has got it wrong, but the intriguing thing for me is that the Vogon attack, the tea and the seance are all from episode 9 of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio series. Episode 9 of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is not actually recorded until November 1979. However, it was due to be recorded in July 1979. It was postponed because in July and August Douglas Adams and Jeffrey Perkins were working on the LP version of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, as I said, is an adaptation of episodes 1 to 4. This seems to confirm that certainly in July they knew they were going to be doing episodes 1 to 4. But if episode 9 was planned for recording in July, then in June and maybe even in May, Douglas Adams would have had a pretty good idea of what was going to go into episode 9. This would possibly be at the same time when he is missing all those deadlines and eventually finishing the page he's on. If you read the end of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy book and then move straight on to Restaurant at the End of the Universe, that episode 9 sequence worked really well as an ending to the novel. It's actually a fantastic ending. It's much better than the ending we get. So I can't help thinking that the page he was on was in fact him attempting to put the notes he has for episode 9 down as the ending of the full novel. But because they're so fragmentary and there's not enough time to edit them and get them into a proper order or correct order, they eventually have to fall back and we get the ending that we end up with. Now this is of course pure speculation. It could just as well have been, like I said, a coda, or alternatively the page he was working on might have been page 64 because it was a mess and it just needed a lot of work. I can't say I won't say we will never know, but certainly I don't have access to find these things out. It might be moderately interesting to point out the way that the episodes of the second season of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fit into the Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Essentially, the first part of Restaurant at the End of the Universe is episode 9. It is then followed by episodes 7, a remake of episodes 7 and 8, just featuring Zaphod, and also including little bits from episodes 10 and 11. We then move on to the ending of episodes 11, beginning of episode 12, where we meet Zarni Whoop, and then we get episodes 5 and 6, as rewritten by Douglas Adams, which includes The Dish of the Day, Hot Black Desiato, and of course the Disaster Area stunt ship. instead of the Agamemnon Death Flotilla, which I miss. We interrupt the end of episode 6 to head over to the end of episode 12, where we meet the man in the shack, or at least Zaphod, Trillian and Zarniwoop do, before we head off back to an adapted version of episode 6 for the final part of Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Now, one thing I do find slightly intriguing is if we go back to chapter 4 of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, they prefigure the man in the shack. In fact, the things they say about the President in episode 12 of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy are much the same as the things they say about the President of the Galaxy in chapter 4 of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was written a considerable time before. Restaurant at the End of the Universe was issued to great fanfare to the launching of the launching of a large whale off Tower Bridge and the release of a large number of rubber ducks, which coincided with the release of the LP. The second LP is an adaptation just of episodes 5 and 6, but with the John Lloyd stuff removed, and things like The Dish of the Day, Hot Black Desiato, and the Disaster Area Stunt Ship included. Another thing to mention about 1980, when the novel and LP of Restaurant at the End of the Universe were released in the UK, this is also the publication date of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in the US. This in itself caused an ongoing problem, a problem that has never been properly resolved. The fact is that Americans don't always get British comedy. Well, they do, but it takes them a while to catch on. There is a story that early New York screenings of Monty Python and the Holy Grail didn't actually get any laughs until the Black Knight had lost both his arms and one of his legs. It is understandable, therefore, that the publishers may have wished to indicate that The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was a funny book. They did this by creating this creature. It is known as the Cosmic Cutie, or sometimes Jeremy Paxman, although since you'd only understand the pun, as in Jeremy Paxman, if you were British, I very much doubt that is true. Douglas Adams hated the Cosmic Cutie. He campaigned, he cajoled, he shouted, he begged for the Cosmic Cutie to be removed from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books. But the publishers were adamant that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy would always be associated with the Cosmic Cutie. You see online, when British people tell Americans that Douglas Adams hated the Cosmic Cutie, they say, but it is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's what it's all about. But the fact is, Douglas Adams hated it. And the publishers have known this for decades at this point. The American publishers have shown how much they admire, respect, and deeply love Douglas Adams by continuing to use the Cosmic Cutie unabated. So that's a kind of history of the writing of the first couple of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books. I hope it's been informative. All I can say about accuracy is that I probably haven't been entirely accurate, but where I have been inaccurate, I hope I have been, well, definitively inaccurate. Goodbye.